Okay, who has heard of grafted tomatoes before? Okay, Liz Grasnick. Okay, all right, well, very good, very good. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about tomato grafting today. Some of you may already know this stuff, but I did want to kind of run through it in case we have any new people in the audience or just some current information. So let's get into this. My name is Kelly McGowan. I'm a field specialist in horticulture for University of Missouri Extension in the Springfield, Missouri office. And I've been involved with grafted tomato research for going on about 3 years now. So this is just a little bit about some of our experiences and kind of where we're going with that. Okay, so why use grafted tomatoes? I get asked this quite a bit. Why use grafted tomatoes? Why not just use regular tomatoes? Well, because the rootstock that is used in tomato grafting has a lot of good qualities about it. It has improved vigor, and we definitely seen this in our grafting research. We did research comparing ungrafted plants to grafted plants, and by far the grafted plants outperformed the regular plants. And that's because of the increased vigor of this rootstock. In addition to that, there are lots of good resistance to soil-borne diseases and other soil issues. And that is because typically in a high tunnel, unless you have a movable high tunnel, that is a fixed structure. So we want to prevent soil diseases from building up in that high tunnel. And if we do have diseases in there, this is a good way to overcome that and still use that tunnel, is by the use of grafted plants. And so when we have a grafted plant, the rootstock, this part right here, is kind of a plant that's been bred for some of these things, for that improved vigor, for that resistance to some of these issues. So we have the rootstock, and then we graft on the scion part, and that has characteristics of the ones that we want to grow, whether it be a BHN 589. We also experimented with some heirloom type of tomatoes, such as Cherokee Purple. And so that's where we get to put in the types of tomatoes we want. But you get the tomato that you desire on this improved rootstock. So here are just a few examples of some of the things that the rootstock can have resistance to. And you might notice here that in addition to tomatoes, we have cucumbers, we have melons, watermelons, peppers, eggplant. Those can also be grafted. And this is a pretty common practice in some other parts of the world. They pretty much use all grafted plants for all of these crops. But here are some more common things that we do see here in the Midwest, in Missouri, and these are just some of the types of rootstocks that are available to combat some of these different issues. Okay, so how can we benefit from using grafted tomatoes? Well, because of that increased vigor of that rootstock, that's going to increase the efficiency of nutrient and water uptake. Okay, not that regular ungrafted tomatoes don't have those things, but these improved rootstocks are much more efficient, and that's why we get that improved vigor. And because of that, we don't have to use as much fertilizer as we would typically have to with ungrafted plants. Also, because of the increased vigor of these rootstocks, we can have a double stem pruning instead of just a single stem, which is true for most of our tomatoes. We usually, whether it's a determinate or an indeterminate, those are typically pruned to a central leader. But when we're using these grafted plants, we can have a double stem, which is going to double production, double the amount of tomatoes, double the yield, and the plant is able to handle having those two double stems. Lower plant density. You don't have to have as many plants when you're using grafted tomatoes. The yield is higher, so instead of trying to cram as many plants as you can in a high tunnel, you can get by with less and have the same amount of yield. And the reason that this is a good thing is because, as probably all of you know from at least sitting in our sessions this morning, tomatoes are very susceptible to several different types of diseases, and those diseases love wet foliage. And whenever we have a high tunnel packed full of plants, those leaves are not going to be able to dry, they're going to hold moisture, and you're going to have better airflow, which is definitely beneficial to disease control as well. Oh, did I skip one? Okay, so some limitations of grafting. There is a cost associated with it. Whether you want to purchase the plants already grafted or you want to try to do it yourself, there is a cost for the seeds. The seeds for the root stocks can be a little bit pricey, sometimes $1 to $2 a seed. Space, you've got to have the space, you've got to have the supplies, and you've got to have the labor to be able to do the grafting yourself if you're wanting to do that. And this is kind of the way grafting works, is you have to select the scion and rootstock that you want to use, and you have to plan ahead because those things have to be ordered. And then you have to plant the seeds, and then you have to schedule the best time to graft. And this can be very tricky. Typically, the scion plants are started first. The root stalks are going to grow pretty quickly, so we want to go ahead and plant the scion seeds, let them start to get some growth on them, and then plant our rootstock seeds. And the tricky part of this is whenever you graft, you want your plants that you're going to be grafting to be a certain diameter, and they have to match up. And it is really tough to get those to match up, really tough. And I say that because I attempted to have a tomato grafting workshop about a month ago, and we just could not get our timing down on the rootstocks and scion. We had a pretty cool gray spring, our plants weren't growing as they should, and we just could never make the workshop go because we couldn't get these two to match up for the grafting. So there's a lot of skill in that and some luck as well. So sometimes this can be pretty tricky. But once you have your plants ready to go, you make your grafts. You have to monitor the healing process, and I'm going to show you a little bit about that, or some examples of the healing chamber in just a moment. And then once they have healed, they have to kind of acclimate, and then they could go out to the field. So you have to kind of go through all of these steps as opposed to just plopping a plant in the ground. Okay, so I know this is small and kind of hard to read, but this is the research project that I've been involved with for the last couple of years. And we used Big Dina, Cherokee Purple, BHN 589, and Edix. Those were the four that we compared grafted versus ungrafted plants. And I just kind of wanted to show you some cost comparison. So for instance, Big Dina, that's a pretty common high tunnel tomato plant. An ungrafted plant averages about 93 cents a plant. A grafted plant is about $2.81 a plant. So there is definitely more expense up front, but the yields by far will make up for that price difference, by far. One thing I do want to show you here is when we did our research, we purchased the plants already grafted, and we had them mail ordered in. And I think we had 8 flats of plants, and shipping for 8 flats of plants was $127. But even with that factored into this price, the grafted plants far outperformed the ungrafted plants. Another thing that I want to mention here is if you have never used grafted plants before and you want to purchase these, they are often grown to order. And most of the companies that sell grafted plants, you have to let them know about 10 weeks ahead of time. So this is something you kind of have to think through, decide what types you want to get, and let that company let that company know so they can grow those plants for you. Okay, so there's a couple of different ways that you can graft. The first is the cleft graft, and this is kind of a picture of what it looks like right here. So you've got your root stock, and you kind of chop off the top of the root stock, and then you make a little cut down the center of that root stock very carefully. And then you've got your scion piece, and on your scion piece, you kind of want to make it kind of a wedge shaped or a V shaped on the end, and then basically that just kind of sticks down in there is the way that that works. And then there are different types of clips that can be used to hold that graft in place as it heals. So tube grafting is probably the most common type of graft used with tomatoes. And basically the way that that works is your root stock piece, you want to make a cut on an angle, and then your scion piece, you want to make a cut also on an angle to match up with that. And then I know it's kind of a blurry picture, but there's a little tube that slides down over this, and then you can just stick your scion piece down in there to match those up. So some of these little tubes kind of clip on, some of them kind of slide on, but this really gives you good contact between the root stock and the scion. You can really get it matched up pretty closely, and that little plastic thing holds it together while it heals. Okay, and so here's some pictures here. So a colleague and I went and visited Dr. Carrie Rivard at Kansas State University about a month or so ago, and he does a lot of grafting for some local producers. I think Liz gets her plants from Dr. Carrie Rivard too, if I remember correctly. But he is amazing to watch graft. He can knock out a tray of grafted plants. I think it took him 5 or 10 minutes. It was amazing. He made it look really easy. But this is, he's got his tray of root stalks ready to go here. He's got his little clips on there. And then the next step is putting the scion piece down in there. And so here it is with the scion pieces in there. And again, these just kind of line up, and basically that's it. So once you get your graft done, that is what it is supposed to look like. Okay, healing chamber. So after you have done your grafting, the plants have to go in a healing chamber. And so day 1 through 3, they need to be completely dark. And you can do this in a number of different ways. I have seen all kinds of things made into a healing chamber. So this is something you can just use supplies you have on hand, but you need to fix up some kind of thing where it is completely dark for these plants for about 1 to 3 days. They also need humidity. And in years past, when we have done tomato grafting workshops and we have made a healing chamber, we have just purchased a humidifier at like Walmart and just kind of ran it in there, and that worked just fine. Now you have to watch that humidifier that it doesn't run out of water and all of that, but that's really all you need. So getting into day 4 and 5, you want to gradually increase your light during that time, kind of raise up the sides and let a little bit of sunlight get in there. You can start to turn down that humidifier a little bit. And then by day 6 or 7, hopefully those grafts have started to heal, and you can begin to start taking that outer cover off to give it a little bit more ventilation. So after about 7 to 10 days, hopefully your graft will start to heal. They amazingly will heal pretty quickly, and sometimes the little plastic piece just kind of falls off on its own. But after the graft is healed, then you can start the hardening off process. And if you're not familiar with that term, we do this with a lot of seedlings. We don't just plop seedlings in the ground on a hot day. We want to gradually kind of acclimate them to life outdoors. So that's what happens typically in a greenhouse on days 7 to 10. Okay, so after they are hardened off, then it is time to go into the ground. Now, if you have not planted grafted tomatoes before, you want to make sure that the graft union is above the soil line, okay? And that's kind of the opposite of what we usually do with tomatoes, because we usually try to plant them deep. Well, with grafted plants, we don't want to plant deep because we want that graft union above the soil line. If we don't do that, the scion part of the grafted plant is going to be, below the soil, and this will start to put out roots, and it defeats the purpose of having this improved vigor rootstock. So just make sure that that is well above the soil line. So reduce plant dentin, I think we talked about that. And then one thing that you really want to do with your grafted tomatoes is you want to monitor them for root suckering. So I think we talked about suckering this morning. Well, with grafted plants, the root stock will try to send up suckers, okay? And you want to monitor that and keep those pinched off, ideally when they're still very, very small. And you'll have to monitor it throughout the growing season. Okay, so this is kind of an interesting picture here. So this is a comparison with non-grafted versus grafted on a maxi-fort rootstock. And it may not look like that much of a difference, but with just yields only, it is amazing at how much more you get with the grafted plants. And of course, they do get larger and healthier as well. So just a little bit about some of the research that we have been doing and are still doing. So in 2020 and 2021, we did a comparison study on those 4 cultivars that I just mentioned between ungrafted plants and grafted plants, both in a high tunnel and a field planting. And the purpose of this project was to compare yields with both types, but it was mainly just to introduce farmers and backyard growers to grafted plants. We want to encourage growers to give these grafted plants a try and just see for yourself how well that they perform. So this was mainly to just raise awareness for grafted plants and just show what could be done with those. One thing that we have really seen with our research is that we need a local source for grafted plants. We don't have that, at least none that I'm aware of. You may occasionally find some grafted plants locally for sale, but for the most part, they have to either be purchased or you have to try to do it yourself. And there is really, I believe, a market for grafted plants. And our current phase of this project is we are setting up a grafting display greenhouse at a farm down in southwest Missouri, and we're going to have some on-farm workshops and train people on how to graft their own plants, either for personal use or to sell those plants. And this is why we need a source for locally grafted plants. So we had a time getting the plants in for our research, actually both years. We mail ordered all of our plants. This particular case here, the plants came in over Memorial Day weekend. And so they were literally in a FedEx greenhouse in Springfield for about 4 days, and we didn't know it. And so when the plants finally came in, they were all dried out. The plants, had been in a box for several days, and this is what we were left with. And, sometimes they can recuperate from that, but once they get dried out, they're just really going to struggle. Now, the company that we purchased these from was wonderful to work with. I think it was Banner Greenhouse. They were wonderful, wonderful customer service, and they replaced all of the plants. But it's just hard. It's hard to ship these types of plants long distances without something like this happening. And FedEx doesn't know. They don't know how sensitive these plants are. So. Anyway, this is just some photos of the trials that we did. I don't know, I wasn't really impressed with the Cherokee Purple on the grafted rootstock. We found that the core of these Cherokee Purples, it was mainly core. There wasn't any like meat to the tomato for whatever reason. And I don't know if that was because of the graft or we just had some bad seed or what it was. But we weren't real impressed with the Cherokee Purple on the grafting anyway. But these others did really well, and definitely highly recommend those. Okay, so couple of takeaways on this. There is an increased cost to using grafted plants, but the increase in yield by far makes up for that increased cost, by far. And then again, we need locally sourced grafted plants in all parts of the state because there is an increase in demand. I think we're going to continue to see an increase in demand. And we need to have those plants available for people to purchase or teach people to graft their own plants, because once you get the technique down, it's really not that bad. So just a few resources here. I mentioned Dr. Carrie Rivard at Kansas State University. The University of Oregon has a lot of great resources on their website about grafted plants. University of Missouri, we're doing research with grafted plants. And Webb City Farmers Market in Jasper County, Missouri, they have been pretty supportive financially of our research as well. Okay, so I think that is it. There's my contact information. Does anyone have any questions?
What's your favorite rootstock so far?
I really like the Maxi Fort. I really like the Maxi Fort. And so one year when we were doing research, I had an extra Maxi Fort rootstock, and I'm like, I'm just gonna stick that in the ground and see what happens. And my goodness, it was like a monster tomato plant. It didn't really produce anything, but my goodness, that plant grew and grew. It was just this massive bush, and I did nothing to it. So, but yeah, that's been one of my favorites.
Anybody else have any questions in the room? If you want to think on that, I got one in the chat here for you,
Okay.
Kelly. Why are grafted tomatoes better for the double stem technique?
Because the rootstock has increased vigor. It's just a more vigorous rootstock, and it's able to support two stems as opposed to a single stem. And that's one of the main benefits of it.
And then I think you addressed this already, but if you planted a grafted plant with that graft union below the soil line, what could go wrong there?
The scion is now buried, so it's going to start producing roots. And that's going to kind of defeat the purpose of having that grafted rootstock. You don't want the scion to start producing roots, because as soon as it starts producing roots, the energy of that scion is going to go into keeping those roots alive as opposed to making fruit. So, yeah.
I don't know if you guys probably didn't look into this in your research, but like flavor, like I've heard some people say, it might tweak the flavor a little bit, or is that anything you've heard about? Or
I have not. I haven't heard of any negatives when it comes to flavor with the grafted plants. I don't think I have ever heard anything about it. And we did some taste testing, and we didn't find any differences.
And I guess kind of a follow-up question in the chat here. If that scion did get rooted, it would still produce tomatoes, but it would not benefit from that graft.
It would still produce tomatoes, but not as many. Again, because the plant's energy is going into, putting down roots as opposed to making tomatoes. But you'd still get some.
Okay. If the Zoom folks have any additional questions, drop them in the chat here. And we got one in the audience here.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, is there a likelihood of the scion, characteristics of the scion having characteristics of the rootstock having effect on the scion in terms of the fruits? Let's say the size of the fruit of the rootstock, can it have effect on the scion, the fruit that the scion will bring up after the grafting? Let me give you an example.
Okay.
A friend of mine grafted tomatoes on eggplant.
Mm-hmm.
And when the tomatoes started fruiting, the skin or the outer part of the fruit didn't become soft, but it became hard like the garden eggs.
Okay, that's really interesting. Well, I mentioned Cherokee Purple. That was an heirloom tomato that we grafted. And we did see that rootstock, it was just all core. Like you slice open the tomato and there wasn't any meat on the tomato. It was just all like a really hard core. And I did some research on that, and I've heard other people say that too. And they think it's because for some reason that rootstock, it affected the fruit and it made it less desirable. And we don't really know why. So yeah, absolutely that can happen. Yeah.
So we have another question here. I think this might be related to maybe the eggplant question. A scion could be grafted on other plant roots. I'm guessing maybe they're thinking potentially within the same family, peppers, tomatoes being put on pepper, eggplant.
So that's a good question, because I love to look through seed catalogs and seed companies, and sometimes you'll see like a plant and it's got, I guess one example that comes to mind is a tomato was grafted on a potato. And so they had pulled the plant up out of the ground and it had all these potatoes in the root zone, and then it had tomatoes on top. I don't know if that was a real picture or not, but there is claims out there that you can do things like that. I don't know how successful they are, but I have seen that. Yeah.
So maybe something to play around with, but don't bank on it.
Yes. And if somebody's successful, I would love to hear about it. Yeah.
Okay. I don't see any more questions in the chat here. Any final questions or thoughts in the room?
All right. Well, if you guys decide you want to use grafted plants, or you think of a question later, just reach out and I'll be happy to assist. Oh, one more.
So I was just wondering, because didn't they say that belladonna and tomatoes are in the same family group? Could you graft them, and since belladonna is poisonous, right?
Mm-hmm.
So would that have some effect on the fruit still too? Like, would that make the tomato more poisonous?
It could possibly, because the toxins are going to be produced from the root zone of that plant. And so theoretically, it could transfer those toxins to the tomato. So I haven't seen any studies on that, but I would think there would be a possibility of that.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Good question.
Yeah, good question.
Double check the chat one last time here. Good. Okay.
Good.
All right. Well, thank you, Kelly. Let's give Kelly a round
Thank
of applause.
Thank you.
Kelly is a great resource. If you got her email there, if you guys have questions about grafted plants, very good to work with, and a wealth of knowledge of all things horticulture.